I want to welcome everybody to this new year of presentations from the ANS Risk-Informed Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee. We call it RP3C. This is the first presentation for 2024 in this series of webinars which began in February of 2020. The purpose of these webinars is to offer practitioners of these approaches that we call risk-informed and performance-based approaches. It offers the practitioners an opportunity to share their experience with the concepts and methods and describe how they are implementing it in relation to their application of nuclear technology and evaluating its safety. RP3C, as a committee of ANS, has been putting on these events and the presentations and recordings of the events are available to the public at the ANS website under the tab RP3C. There are now about 40 such recordings available. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. The Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, which was passed in 2019 and is usually referred to as NEMA, associates modernization with application of RIPB approaches. There is growing realization within the nuclear community that conventional, prescriptive, and deterministic approaches are not going to support increasing use of nuclear technology to play its rightful role to benefit society. ANS offers the COP files on its website to serve as a knowledge repository of the experience from a wide range of practitioners in the field. We hope that more people will use this knowledge base to speed up needed changes in the state-of-the-art for safe and efficient use of nuclear technology. These events are generally scheduled for the last Friday of a month. Today, we will hear from Brandon Chisholm about a very novel kind of reactor. And Brandon will introduce himself and the presentation. But we have, Dan, did you have your hand up?
No, I was clapping for Brandon Chisholm's introduction.
Okay. Brandon, I'll let you take it away from there. Thank you.
Okay, great. And thank you for the applause, Dan. So I'm sharing my screen real quick. Okay, that should be the presentation. So yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brandon Chisholm. I am a senior research engineer at Southern Company Services. That is distinct from the Southern Nuclear Operating Company. And today we'll be talking about the development of a risk-informed and performance-based safety case for TerraPower's molten chloride reactor experiment, which you will hear me say over and over as MCRE. I would like to start off by saying, for those of you that are watching this later on YouTube, please make sure that you hit that like button and smash the subscribe. Really trying to monetize this this channel here so that I can become an influencer. But I'm actually presenting on behalf of a much larger project than just Southern Company. The molten chloride reactor experiment is a risk reduction award under the Department of Energy's Advanced Reactor Demonstration Project. So I've got my NASCAR panel down here with a lot of our project partners. So there's too many individuals to thank, but I will like to acknowledge Xander and Troy, who are the other two safety leads for this project from TerraPower and INL, respectively. Before we get into business here, I do have a proposal for Prasad and Pat. You know, we've got the RP3C, and we keep calling these community of practices the COP, but if we call it the community of practice with Pat, Prasad, and others, then we can call it C3PO, and I wanted to put a picture of a little golden robot on there, but I didn't want Disney to get mad about copyright infringement. So here is our agenda for today. I'll start off with a quick project overview. We'll talk a little bit about the reactor design and the associated technology. And then really the focus of today is the safety case strategy. So we'll talk about the probabilistic risk assessment. We'll talk about the safety basis events that we developed. We'll talk about the safety classification of the MCRE SSCs, a little bit about defense in-depth adequacy, and then conclusions. So of course I'm reminded of Willy Wonka that we have too much time and too little to do, or we can scratch that and reverse it. If you put a question in the chat and it's something that I can get to during the presentation, then I'll try my best to do that. But otherwise, like Pat said, we'll get to them at the end. So here's the mission statement for MCRE. Really, this is about testing key reactor physics phenomena and hypotheses to support the commercialization of the molten chloride fast reactor technology, ultimately through the licensing and operation of a demonstration reactor that we call MCFRD. So there's a number of objectives down here, right? Achieving criticality with the first fast spectrum molten salt fueled reactor. There have been liquid fueled reactors previously, but they have never achieved criticality with a fast spectrum MSR. This is a physics experiment. We'll talk about that over and over again today. You'll see that this is a very simple machine to achieve a fairly straightforward set of objectives. However, handling the fuel loading, fuel salt sampling analysis, and handling strategy for chloride fuel salt, this will be the first time that this has been done in history. So demonstrating that and getting those lessons learned will be valuable to this technology and potentially to others. Also developing a supply chain for the key components to be operated in a high temperature and a radioactive environment. And then ultimately, I think what we'll focus on most today is collecting data to help lay the foundation for an operating license for an MCFRD. However, it's not just about the data that this machine will gather. You'll see as we talk about the approach that we've used for the DOE authorization of the molten chloride reactor experiment, we're not just looking at the quantitative data that comes out of the machine, but we're also exercising the same process that we would like to exercise for an NRC licensed machine. And so we are gathering experience, getting shots on goal, identifying pinch points in the process along the way. So now we are going to talk about the preliminary design of the molten chloride reactor experiment. Just one note, the safety information that we'll be talking about today is from the conceptual safety design report. So the design information that's in here is a little bit more mature than the information that we used as we were developing the information that went into the CSDR and some of the safety analyses that we'll talk about. That just kind of has to do a little bit with the lead lag of the integrated safety and design approach, and also just making sure that we are allowing the Department of Energy to do their due diligence in reviewing the information that we have submitted. Ultimately, this is their safety case, and so there's certain information that I won't be able to talk about today until we've gotten buy-in from the regulator, and we'll be able to share that information later on. So you see these parameters over here on the left-hand side. I won't go through every single one of these numbers. It is a sodium chloride, uranium trichloride eutectic for the fuel salt using high enriched uranium. We get a lot of questions about why high enriched uranium and not HALEU. Probably the shortest answer is that using high enriched uranium allows us to fit this within the Lotus cell that we'll talk about in the next slide. Additionally, the HEU that we're using is already on site at INL, will be controlled by INL the entire time, and will never essentially leave the security boundary that INL has set up for this type of information. And then if folks are interested in understanding the benefits of a HEU for an experimental or a special purpose reactor, I'm happy to share some information that another individual wrote in terms of evaluating the benefits of using higher rich uranium for these types of special purpose reactors. Another question that we get a lot is the material that we're using for the fuel salt facing structural material, like the fuel salt piping. We're using alloy 625, and the short answer of why 625 is based on extensive corrosion test data that TerraPower has developed in their lab using chloride salts, various alloys with a test matrix. There is a very good literature out there written by Brian Kelleher that summarizes that experience. I can also point you in the direction of that information if that would be of interest to you. So here are the major fuel salt systems. There are other systems that are left off from this little cartoon for MCRE, like a cover gas system that you can see the interfaces for here, but it starts getting really complicated if you try to put everything on one page. The reactor core is a very simple external loop. You have your vessel where the fuel salt will go critical as it is being pulled up by the pump and then circulated around the loop. You'll notice that there is no active heat removal. It is passively rejecting heat to the cell atmosphere. Again, this is a simple system designed for experimentation, so pulling heat out of this thing is not a major function for which it was designed. And then you'll notice that there are various other structure systems and components over here to the right-hand side that are part of the fuel handling system. So we have a fuel tank that is designed for the fuel salt to be stored in a subcritical configuration using geometry and using other materials. The transfer from the fuel handling system and the reactor core is not gravity like you have seen potentially on other MSR designs like the Abilene Christian University Molten Salt Research Reactor or Oak Ridge's Molten Salt Reactor experiment. Based on the vertical challenges that we had in the cell, this transfer is pneumatic. So now we go a little bit more into 3 dimensions instead of that 2-dimensional cartoon. And here again, you see the fuel salt loop, the transfer line, the fill drain line that goes over to the fuel handling system into that fuel tank. Around this fuel salt vessel or the reactor vessel, you have your reactivity control rods that are spaced equally azimuthally around the vessel, and that is there are channels within these neutron reflector bricks. It is implied by the name of molten chloride fast reactor technology, but I will explicitly say that this is a fast spectrum reactor, so there is no moderator that is intentionally put in or around this reactor vessel. And then the reactor bricks sit inside what we call the reactor furnace. And so you can see here that we have the insulation that has heater panels on the inside. So we heat this inside to that operating temperature that you saw earlier, 600 to 650 C. The pump hangs basically from this reactor support structure that you see here on the outside. And I think that's really the major components on this slide that I wanted to talk about. There's a standpipe here and a level standpipe that will indicate the level of the fuel salt and essentially where our fuel salt and cover gas interface is. So just to give a shout out to our partners at the National Reactor Innovation Center out at INL or NRIC, we are siting this reactor at the old Zipper building, which is this spaceship looking thing down here. It has been renamed as the Lotus cell to be a test bed. And so if there are folks that are interested in testing small reactors, I would highly encourage you to reach out to the folks at NRIC. I can get you contact information if you're interested. Here's a nice picture of the inside of the cell, and you might say, wow, there's pretty roomy in there. But as soon as you start putting the reactor in there, all these other auxiliary systems, and you start putting in the shielding, you realize you run out of room pretty quickly. So the cell's filling up, that's just kind of an artifact of getting through the design process and realizing as you're going from a piece of paper with some blocks on it to actual components that there's quite a lot of things associated with even such a simple reactor as MCRE. So the reactor safety philosophy, for those of you that are familiar with NEI 1804, the licensing modernization process or project, I'm sorry, that approach, you'll notice a lot of shared concepts, diagrams as we go through the next slides. We are using that LMP methodology to develop a risk-informed performance-based safety case, which again is a project decision for us to gain experience and understand how to exercise that approach with this technology. With such a small reactor design and a relatively low burnup over the course of the operational lifetime of this machine, it would be an option for us to do a more deterministic or prescriptive approach to reactor safety. However, like I said at the beginning, we really want the benefits to be realized beyond just the quantitative data that comes out of this machine. So we got the 3 classic fundamental safety functions plus shielding is added as another fundamental safety function. We can get into the philosophy of what stands as fundamental. However, this is one of the things that starts to get a little bit different between NRC application and DOE authorization of a reactor using LMP, is that the LMP approach, as you look at it within NRC, is really focused on public health and safety, and we start adding considerations for worker protection very explicitly within the DOE authorization framework. And I mentioned integration of safety in the design. You'll see that as we go through here, a lot of systems engineering concepts are incorporated here, but also even the fact that we've submitted a conceptual safety design report. Another distinction here between the NRC regulatory framework and the DOE authorization framework is that there are a few more explicit expectations, I should say, not necessarily requirements, for early and often engagement with the regulator to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So this is the first time that a risk-informed performance-based approach has been applied to a liquid-fueled molten salt reactor. To my knowledge, we will go through this entire process of risk assessment through consequence estimation, transient analysis, identifying the safety SSCs, and then evaluating defense in-depth adequacy through the rest of the slides in this presentation. Again, I apologize for all the colors and how busy this slide is for folks that have spent a lot of time with NEI 2107 and the Technology Inclusive Content of Application project. This slide is adapted directly from one of the figures in that guidance. The short version of what is on this slide is that we are essentially starting from those high-level fundamental safety functions, and we are working as we move from left to right on this slide to much more specific requirements that get implemented, very similar to the implementation of systems engineering, right? So we start with the generic fundamental safety functions. We use our hazard and risk assessment to identify the events of when we need to meet the performance objectives of those fundamental safety functions. We identify the design-specific PRA safety functions, and then we map those to various structure, systems, and components that we have present in the design, and we start moving more from the functional requirements down to the specific requirements within the design. So, you know, mapping those down to performance targets for individual SSCs. And fast forwarding to potential commercial deployment, does the U.S. supply chain still exist for HALO? Okay, that's a little bit beyond the scope of here, so maybe we'll get to that at the end. Okay, to talk a little bit about how we identified those PRA safety functions, here's a slide on the probabilistic risk assessment that was developed for MCRE. You can see here an example of one of the event trees that was developed, and you can see here that there are 4 distinct PRA safety functions, those being reactivity control, the presence or availability of AC power, the offload or the drain of the fuel from the reactor to the fuel tank, and then the ability to add heat from those electric heaters that are in the reactor vessel. So one thing when Prasad and I were talking about this presentation earlier that I think you'd be very mad if I didn't mention is that although we're using the term PRA safety functions here because that's from NEI 1804, there are, whether or not you have a PRA, there still are safety functions present. And I'm being facetious about saying that Prasad's angry. I very much agree with that, right? You know, the risk triplet doesn't necessarily require quantification or a logical structure like this PRA. However, this is the approach that's outlined in NEI 1804, so this is what we're using for MCRE. You can see here that we have the elements that are in the ANS, ASME, non-LWR PRA standard, and we flow that here through to understand what our SBE identification is so that we can generate our frequency consequence curves, which will be on the next slide. Oh, it's not on the next slide. It is, I lied, it's one more slide. So here is our analysis of safety basis events. I don't want this to seem like it is a big commercial, but I would like to thank the folks at Numerical Advisory Solutions for the work that they've done on this project, not directly, but with TerraPower to add certain capabilities to the Gothic code. And for folks that are interested in doing a systems level model of a liquid fueled molten salt reactor, I'd highly recommend that you check out Gothic because, you know, I think the big thing here is the modified point kinetic scheme to account for the reactivity changes due to flow variations and the tracking of the delayed neutron precursors. You can see here that we have our flow sheet of how we identify the modeling requirements to set up the Gothic model that you see represented very basically here. Yes, so this is coupled thermohydraulic and nuclear kinetic response of the system. So here is I do have to change my pointer option to get this to play. So here's a video on the left-hand side. It's not just the steady state conditions that we're modeling with Gothic or even just accident conditions. Here, this animation is showing actually a really cool animation that, to my knowledge, is the first time that this has been done. Others might have done it, but when Xander at TerraPower showed me this animation, I was very impressed with showing the actual draining of the fuel from the reactor vessel and the fuel salt loop into the fuel salt tank. This allows us to basically model the entire safety strategy, right? Because ultimately the way that we have set up our reactivity control philosophy is that we do have those control rods that are rapidly adding negative reactivity if we find ourselves in a scenario that we would like to stop the fission reaction. However, the ultimate safe, stable end state to ensure indefinite subcriticality is to transfer this fuel salt into that fuel tank where the subcriticality is ensured by the geometry and the materials that of construction for that fuel tank in that vessel. Over on the right-hand side, you can see the results of some of the safety basis events that we have identified. The bottom line here is that the simulations show significant margin to temperatures that could challenge the fuel salt barriers. And then as we take the frequencies that were generated from the PRA and we take the consequences that were estimated based on our analysis of the safety basis events using our systems level model, as well as our mechanistic source term that was developed, we populate these frequency consequence charts. And I say these because this is the one for worker dose, but we also have one for public dose. And although on the previous slide, you may be saying, well, you just showed me a chart that says that you have a lot of margin in terms of temperature between your SBEs and your design temperature. We do have safety basis events that involve failure modes that are not just over temperature. So unfortunately, because we have not gotten the agreement from the Department of Energy, I cannot show you the dots that fall on these different frequency consequence charts. So just use your imagination and think about dots being in these areas over here and having explicit uncertainty bars for the frequency. Coming up as we continue to mature the design and safety analysis, we'll be looking at adding uncertainty as well for the consequence estimates. So now, once we have identified essentially the risk profile of the machine, we can start identifying which SSCs we are relying upon to perform certain functions to meet those performance objectives to achieve acceptable performance. And the safety classification includes consideration of the uncertainties that we have, either quantitative or qualitative. And I will mention here that criticality safety considerations actually play a significant role in the MCRE SSC safety classification. And again, this is a little bit different from how the LNP approach is applied within the NRC framework. The criticality safety considerations are an explicit expectation and requirement from our hosts at INL and the regulator at DOE. So there are classification implications on various SSCs related to ensuring that we have no credible inadvertent criticality scenarios. Again, unfortunately, I can't show the results of the SSC classification. Maybe you'll come back and I'll do a decent enough job this time that Prasad will invite me back and maybe we can update you later on. Also have been updating this process as we've been going along at the ANS meetings. Abdullah at INL has been running those. So there's another teaser for next time that we can talk. So the defense in depth adequacy, this is basically wrapping a bow around the entire safety case and ensuring that we have considered not just the uncertainties that we have quantified, but also the potential for unknown unknowns or even some of the qualitative uncertainties that are present within our safety and risk models of the plant. So there's a little bit, there are a few different flavors of margin that we have, right? So as we progress through the design process, margins associated with design maturity were incorporated via simplifying and bounding assumptions, right? And these can be refined as we further the design and gather more details about the capability or the specific implementation of different functions. There's also margins that are associated with adequate defense in depth, and so this would be met by the elevation of certain functions to a safety significant classification. And then margins associated with parameter uncertainties have been handled by a combination of conservative assumptions, sensitivity studies, and the quantification of uncertainty. Generally, these margins can be reduced as we gather additional data, whether that would be additional simulation and modeling, or whether that would be additional experimentation. Over here on the right-hand side, you can see some of the future work. Again, this is just us being transparent about what we have done and what we haven't done at this point. Some of these things have been done since this table was generated, but you know, as you're progressing through, you're constantly refining, constantly identifying other areas of uncertainty that you may want to reduce. I do see a question here in the chat about any export controlled information. No, the information that's in this presentation has been cleared for public release and is not marked as export control. Oh, I also see a question about the mechanistic source term. So I actually will, before we move into talking about a specific, this is actually a pretty good example here of how we are trying to balance various uncertainties, right? So for folks that are not as familiar with molten salt reactors, one of the major areas of uncertainty is volatility of different constituents within the salt. You know, as you get through, as you increase in burnup and you get through the lifetime of the fuel salt, especially in a longer burnup machine. Again, I will note that MCRE is a pretty short burnup machine, so there's, you know, we're producing relatively few fission products, but just in general, as you produce different constituents and you have corrosion products that are interacting with your fuel salt, you may generate a soup of a lot of different constituents, and there are various vapor pressures and various conditions that, you know, affect the transport of material from that melt that you have in your fuel salt. So, you know, without having a great set of high quality volatility data, we have had to make some pretty bounding assumptions. We did survey the literature to see things that were maybe not in the nuclear space or maybe not exactly our salt composition to understand kind of the orders of magnitude that we would expect for a more, you know, accurate or realistic mechanistic source term. But then at the end of the day, to ensure that we are on the correct side of the uncertainty in these estimates, we have applied some pretty significant bounding assumptions. So, you know, in terms of experimentation that would help reduce some of these margins that are associated with actually just lack of data, you know, additional volatility experiments would help us to reduce the uncertainty, and thereby we could reduce some of the margins for which we've assumed. So here is an example of, we'll talk on the next slide about how we've tied different uncertainties to different margins within the design. This is a quantitative analysis that was done by the engineers at TerraPower to understand essentially what is driving uncertainty within the critical point of this machine, right? So with a liquid fueled machine, there are, you know, it's a little bit stronger in terms of the temperature effect on reactivity. So, you know, essentially you're assuming a critical temperature, and at that point you are looking at the amount of reactivity that you need to add, positive reactivity that you need to add, or negative reactivity that you need to remove in order to allow the system to go critical. And you can see here the components of uncertainty that have been identified as contributing to the overall uncertainty in the critical point. As we look at this, the chlorine-35 nuclear data is actually the primary contributor, and because of that, a gain voucher with Los Alamos National Lab was conducted to gather some additional information to hopefully reduce this uncertainty. But in terms of the design space, the reactor is oversized and the reactivity control is oversized to make sure that we can get this machine started up and we can get this machine shut back down under, you know, with the ±2 sigma coverage. So that's an example down here as we look at managing the uncertainties. That's an example here of this bottom row where, you know, we have a lack of crocks cross-section data that's propagating into the reactivity calculations. And so we've tracked it in a specific matrix. This table here represents more of a qualitative example, but as we've been progressing through the design process, the tracking of the margins and the tracking of the uncertainty has become more and more quantified, right? So the previous slide is the example of this dedicated analysis, and now we have numbers in terms of exactly how much design margin we have in our reactivity control system. In similar manner, right here, we have the retention of various radionuclides by the fuel salt. So Cheyenne, this goes to your question about how are we managing that. We've got the conservative estimates. And then also during operation, we plan to monitor what is coming off of our fuel salt melt and going into our off-gas system, essentially so that we can confirm that our calculations are still conservative or bounding. We have other uncertainties in terms of the component reliability, right? So this, people always ask, well, if you don't have a lot of existing data or operating data for molten salt reactor components, then how are you developing the estimate of the failure rates and to put that into your probabilistic risk assessment? And at this point, we have looked at the environmental conditions within which these systems operate, and it turns out that sodium fast reactor data for many of these conditions are similar temperatures and similar pressures, much more similar than light water reactor components. And then we've also used a pretty liberal application of error factors to ensure that we've got pretty wide bounds on what our frequency looks like. And of course, we also look at sensitivity studies to see if we're, if a small change in frequency would actually result in a big change in our risk calculations. So one full cycle of the risk-informed licensing process has been completed. Here you can see the results of some of our Gothic analyses, an unprotected loss of force flow. You can see here what happens with the power and the response from the inherent reactivity response from the expansion of the fuel salt, essentially turning that back around. We've evaluated 17 safety basis events using that Gothic model, and all of them remain under that 700-degree design temperature. The dose consequence has been compared with the likelihood of events to determine the frequency consequence plots. We use that to derive our structure systems components classification and show defense in depth. And then the safety design integration team, which is implementing the independent decision-making process that is in NEI 1804, has convened essentially as a subjective way to review and ensure adequate defense in depth. And then we submitted our conceptual safety design report in June 2023 to the regulator. We have yet to get that approved, but certainly you'll hear from me when that happens, because I will be quite happy about that. Before I wrap up here, I did see some other questions that I'm going to get to in just a second. I just wanted to note some other ANS efforts that have either directly or indirectly supported some of the work that we've done here. The first one is ANS standard 19.3. So that is on startup and testing for non-light water reactors. We talked about the uncertainty in the critical point and some of the operating parameters for a first of a kind reactor like this. And ANS 19.3 takes that in a technology inclusive approach and has guidance for a variety of other technologies, not just molten salt reactors. And I know that Matt Worgan, who's on this call and at TerraPower, has been involved in that to make sure that it's reflecting elements of the molten chloride fast reactor technology. And then also ANS standard 20.2, which provides design criteria for molten salt reactors. I was talking with Pat right before this, and I know that standard is right on its last leg before it becomes published. Those design criteria, although we are developing our risk-informed performance-based design principal design criteria using the approach that's in NEI 1804 and 2107, you do need a place to start. And so within our approach, we have leveraged the information that's in ANS 20.2 to kind of give designers a place to start. And to start kind of on the first iteration of the design process before we can develop a PRA and before we can analyze it, and then refine that list of principal design criteria as you move forward in the design process. So I've got about 17 minutes left here. And so I see what safety functions or equipment are engineered into the reactor so that you don't have to consider potential criticality accidents when licensing your design. So there's a variety of different areas outside of the reactor that we are considering inadvertent criticality accidents. I think the one that I mentioned a couple times during the conversation was the fuel tank. That's actually an annular design that has absorbing material around it. And I mean, actually, it is inside the annulus, I should say. And so that's one of the engineered safety features. In terms of just other simple approaches, we have worked with the criticality safety team over at INL to determine what is the safe diameter. And so when you look at the, let me see if I can get all the way back to the beginning. When you get to some of these other vessels here, like this measuring cup or some of these buffer tanks, the diameter of these where fuel salt could be contained is kept under that safe diameter to avoid any credible inadvertent criticality scenarios. Oh yeah, it should have been 1913, not 19.3. Sorry about that. Okay. I'm looking at other ones. I see, how would you apply HEU physics and kinetics parameters to a HALEU version of this reactor? I do appreciate that question because I should have explicitly said earlier that yes, the molten chloride fast reactor technology, whether we're talking about a demonstration application or a commercial application, that would be HALEU fueled, that would not be HEU fueled. So Robert, I would to give you a more specific answer, I would have to call in, I'd have to phone a friend and bring in some of the excerpts, but essentially we have the ability to do frequency studies on the design to get to essentially the most fundamental characteristics of the reactor. And so folks that are much smarter than I and basically see the world in ones and zeros have told me that the approach that we're using will allow us to generalize the results that we get from the physics experiments and and in fact, I do have a slide on the experimental campaign here that is in my backups. So these 21 reactor experiments that we have planned between the design of the experimental campaign and the design of the experimental system, this should give us the most flexible set of information that we can gain from this machine, and we can apply that to future machines that in a way that is relatively insensitive even to configuration, right? So if you were to Google molten chloride fast reactor right now, the picture of the little cartoon that you would see would not be an external loop like what we've got at MCRE. It would be an internal loop or pool design. And so, all of these things were considerations in terms of the fact that we are kind of in the pre-conceptual stage for the other NCFR machines. We wanted to make sure that the data that we got out of this machine was as flexible as possible. Okay. Could you talk about special treatments and the potential for procurement problems related to expanding the 1804 methodology to other considerations like worker dose? I think that's a very great question. I think there's a lot of layers to answering that. I guess the best way that I can answer that question is when you look here at this flow chart, it may not communicate it in the right fidelity of information. So as you get these principal design criteria, sorry, I just realized that I probably need to correct the slide a little bit. But these safety significant principal design criteria, as we're calling them here, there's actually another layer in here of safety significant design criteria. Once you've selected your safety significant SSCs, there's a layer that is more. So these principal design criteria are functional, you know, kind of at a similar level to what you would see in the GDC in Appendix A of 10 CFR Part 50. But then when you have mapped those to a specific SSC and then you move down to the next layer and you start getting a little bit more quantitative instead of functional, you're still linking that based on a function. And so in terms of identifying the special treatments, we're being very specific in what we are relying upon the individual structure, system, or component, or even subcomponents of that SSC to perform. So, you know, when you're talking about, for instance, let's say that an inadvertent criticality could be caused by a leakage of salt out of the system, then, you know, that inadvertent criticality that you're trying to avoid, ultimately the failure mode that you're trying to protect is a failure of that pressure boundary. And then you can look at the individual subcomponents that you are trying to prevent from having that failure mode, right? And so even if you look at the welds that you have in that fuel salt piping or the material selection, then you can apply that special treatment in a very narrow sense, not just, okay, boom, my piping is safety significant and that's that. We've really tried to continue to link those functions and flow that down in a way that restricts it to the very narrow manner in which we are crediting that SSC to protect and achieve the performance objectives of the fundamental safety functions. Have you thought about eventual decommissioning plans? I think robotics will be very important for MSR economics. Bruce, I totally agree with the statement about robotics. You know, not even just decommissioning, right? I mean, if we're talking about operating this thing, it's going to be pretty spicy, right, around that reactor, right? You got you know, you're circulating your fissioning material throughout that system, and so things are going to get pretty activated. You're going to have neutrons flying around, and so at the end of the day, remote maintenance is going to be key to some of these things because you're just not going to be able to lay hands on them. In terms of decommissioning plans for MCRE, actually, Christy Spencer at INL is going to be presenting. She's turned in a paper, and I believe I just reviewed a presentation that she's going to be presenting. I don't know at what conference, but they are developing what we are calling the equipment removal and disposal plan at INL, and that is scope that is under Idaho National Labs, so that's part of their scope on this project, and it's commensurate with the design information, right? So it's at the conceptual stage. They've got it defined functionally at this point. I don't know to what extent that robotics will be necessary for this application in general, considering that this machine is, you know, on the order of running for about a year, you know, give it, you know, plus or minus 6 months, or maybe just plus 6 months based on, you know, operational margins. However, the ultimate burnup and activation of this machine shouldn't be too significant to prevent getting in the cell and actually removing things after we've allowed it to decay for a little bit. But I would say if you want to shoot me an email after this, I can probably get you in contact with Christy, and she might be able to give you a little bit more information on that. Could I propose a precise definition of spicy for use in the ANS standards bibliography? I am on the glossary team, so that is perhaps something that I could work on. You know, spicy is a relative term, though, I suppose. Was there any consideration of a spherical versus cylindrical reactor vessel? The sphere would be more efficient neutronically. Steve, I don't know that I have an answer for you on that one. I do not recall seeing any spherical reactor vessels. There may be a consideration of manufacturability that's in there, or even controllability. But that's me just postulating. So I would have to get you more information on that to answer it. Okay, fast forwarding to potential commercial deployment. Does U.S. supply chain still exist for HEU? Okay, so yeah, okay, great. Yeah, correct, Steve. You said that the HALEU would be for the larger scale reactor. So yes, explicitly, I would like to make sure that I'm on record as saying that the plans are not to have a demonstration or a commercial scale reactor that runs on HEU. The commercial or the demonstration molten chloride fast reactor would run on HALEU. The decision for HEU at MCRE was explicitly for the experiment and the requirements that we had for this experimental machine, which is essentially a zero power critical experiment. But yes, I appreciate the question. Estimates of uncertainties in the fission pathways, or is that part of what you're calling uncertainties in the cross-section data? That might be a level of detail below what I have in here. Matt Wargon might be able to give you some more information on that one. I think that might be covered in this all other nuclear data. But again, I am representing work that I did not perform, so I don't want to speak from an uninformed position on that. Okay. Any other questions? Or Prasad, I don't know what you want to do here.
Well, I guess this is my opportunity to ask a question. Have you defined a margin? When you use the term margin on that slide where you had 3 different highlighted margins, how do you define a margin?
How in specific terms, in terms of like quantitatively, or how am I defining the word margin?
Even conceptually, I just want to point out that the guidance on performance-based regulation, New Reg BR 0303, has a formal definition of margins, because margins are very important for implementing a formal performance-based approach. And so there needs to be some way of assessing the adequacy of margins, which I think would be part of assessing the adequacy of defense in depth, on any of the factors that you mentioned. So.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with 0303. I will say explicitly that we have not been using the definition that's in that document. I guess the way that we've been using the term margin is, we have a best estimate, and then we have basically a representation of either the performance or the parameter that we are, the margin would be the difference between what we think would be the best estimate and what we are using to represent it.
That's good enough, Brandon, for now. Bob Youngblood has a question, so let's go to his question.
Oh, yeah. Hi. I had typed one in about RIM, Reliability Integrity Management, because you mentioned ASME Section 3, Division 5, and there's another section, Section 11, Division 2, which is, to my way of thinking, kind of more of a PRA-informed way of managing risks due to high uncertainties in the materials behavior. And so I guess the spirit of the question was, well, if you're not, are your uncertainties low enough that you just don't need that machinery?
You're talking about the machinery that's in Section 11?
Yes.
So one of the challenges with alloy 625, I guess I'll say on the front end, I'm sorry, Bob, but I'm not going to be able to directly answer that. Getting into the materials and that design is again a little bit beyond the bounds of what I've been involved in so far. But I do know that the challenge with choosing 625 as a material is that it is not codified. And so we are actually executing currently a testing plan to gather the information to essentially provide an equivalent level of certainty or confidence in our material. But I can't answer explicitly on Section 11. And I know I just made Todd Anselmi really sad.
Well, yeah, okay. If Todd's sad, then that's all I was shooting for. Thank you.
Well, there's a question on the chat about tools for mechanistic source term. Perhaps you can answer that in the minute or so we have left.
Yeah, so for mechanistic source term, we did estimate partial pressures using FactSage. But in terms of what we're using for the safety basis, it was a lot less complicated than using Gibbs free energy minimization. Essentially, we went to the literature, we surveyed, we got values, and then we used kind of trends to set an assumption. So we have a best estimate that's based on Gibbs free energy minimization. But in terms of what we're using for the mechanistic source term, it's a lot more simplistic than that.
Okay, Brandon, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. And, I think there's a lot of interest in what you presented. And so, I believe that you will get lots of suggestions on how you can become what did you call that? Influencer. In as part of your activities. But anyway, I do like to end these sessions, within the hour. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this first of 2024 Community of Practice sessions. We'll be in touch about the next one. And you can look forward to the announcement from Pat Schroeder on that. So again, thank you all very much. Steve,
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Okay.
Pat?
Thank you. I'll go ahead and end the meeting. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Bye.